Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody. And it's so nice to have this kind of forum, which is like a build on from many forums that some of us identify with and associate with VREF and other partners. So today we are starting a new series that is going to be very interesting. And to roll us out into starting this series would be definitely VREF saying a word before we get into the real stuff that brought us on board. So we will start, as we've always done, with Henrik, who is here to at least give us a word. Then we can get into our business today. Thank you, Henrik.
Thank you, Winnie, and hello, everyone. I think I know most of you, but for those of you who don't know me yet, I'm the director of Volvo Research and Educational Foundations, or VREF, as we call it. It's really nice to be here today, and I'm so delighted to welcome you to this, well, not just this research forum, but it's a mini-series of 3 research forums that celebrate the 5 years of the MAC program. So I don't remember exactly the dates, but we kicked off the MAC program in Addis Ababa, and that was not an online meeting, it was a physical meeting. And I know some of us were there and some of us were not, but it was a very nice starting workshop, and it's almost exactly 5 years since we had that meeting. So what we want to do with this mini-series is, well, first of all, of course, to celebrate the 5 years of, I must say, very successful work in many projects and studies and meetings. Winnie mentioned the research forums. I don't know how many we had, but it's quite a few, and with many presentations. So we celebrate that and the success of the MAC program, of course, and we do that by presenting research from the program. And contrary to in the research forums, we said that it's okay to present work that is ongoing. So quite a few of the presentations were done early or midway in projects with no results really, or preliminary results, but a lot of things to discuss around methodologies and field work and ideas and thoughts. But today and the next 2 mini-series webinars, we will focus on results and findings and knowledge from the projects, and also related to other work that the researchers have been doing. So a bit of summarizing and consolidating the work from the MAC program. It's a series of 3 webinars, one this month, one in October, and one in November. So this one today is equity, to me, is the keyword of and perhaps access and mobility today. The next one is about informal and shared mobility, and practices and challenges in informal and shared mobility in Sub Saharan Africa. And the third one focuses on, or will focus on, planning and governance. So that's transport planning and governance, again in African cities. So this is the series. We will have 3 webinars. The format is 3 hours. 3 presentations and 3 commenters. So there is a lot of 3s there. Just, I don't know if that was intentionally or if it's coincidentally, but it's easy to remember. So this is 1 hour longer than the regular research forum, and the idea is to have more time for discussion. And feel free also to comment and ask questions and so on in the chat. I know that Karen will trigger you to use the chat function, and feel free to use that all throughout the meeting. So with that, I know that Jane, at the end of the meeting, Jane will say a few more words on the coming 2 webinars. But with that, I leave back to Winnie to start off us for today, and really looking forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Henrik. So this is really great. As has been noted by Henrik, this is a special session indeed. And what is good about today's seminar is that we are like more of reflecting on concepts that have been used, very commonly used in in development discourse across as we do development, whether in transport, health, or education. We are talking about justice, we are talking about intersectionality, and we also talk about capability approach. And the good thing about this concept is that concepts are that they quite focus, towards one thing, issues of equity and inclusive development, which means that as we discuss today, we are going to be listening, but they are very overlapping in terms of what they are looking for and all the concepts struggling towards what the world is trying to aim at. Even if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, we are looking for issues of equity and inclusion. And even in our regions within Africa, almost all regions are trying to get that. And it's a struggle as we try to struggle to get into having a world which is at least inclusive. And we see that a lot, that if you look at the three concepts that we are going to engage with this afternoon, on my side, Kenya is afternoon, you will find that they complement each other a lot. Whether you are taking a social justice approach, which is all springing from the broad concept of justice, or whether you are into intersectionality, which is unpacking the different, threads that we weave in identity and communities, or whether we go to capabilities that assist in then endowing with people with functionalities that they can use to exact development. So one thing is conceptual, is very theoretical, but in practice, for some of us who are coming from development studies, we want to see how these concepts apply, especially in transport. How do we ensure that we apply the intersectionality concept into transport such that if we are dealing, for example, with PWDs, we don't generalize and see them as one. Or if we are dealing with gender, we don't generalize and see as one, but we are able to get those disaggregated aspects that make us understand individuals or communities better in effecting development, and in particular in transport. So for me, I have a lot of hope in listening to this and seeing how it applies in transport and also in other sectors. We are basically going to begin by having Carol Martens, but after that, we are going to have a pack of 3 scholars who will get on board to highlight each of those concepts. And then after that, we'll have a pack again of 3 scholars who are going to reflect briefly on 2 of the concepts and then focus on 1. And we hope that after that, the plenary will be able to go deeper. We don't have papers because these are now informed by people's experiences and very many other works that they've done that we can go back and read. Of any of those scholars that will be presenting, you can read their works on those areas that they are presenting about. So let me just begin by getting Carol Martin ready. He can post his PowerPoints. And normally as he does that, I can give a bit of a brief of him so that some of you may not know him, but all people who are in transport know him. But I will give you knowing him as per how you would like us to introduce him as well. So Carol Martens holds a master's degree in spatial planning and a PhD in policy sciences from Radboud University, the Netherlands. He's a full professor of transport planning and holds the David J. Azrieli Chair in Architecture and Town Planning at the Faculty of Architecture and Town Planning, Technion Israel Institute of Technology, where he heads a fair transport lab. Martens is an international expert on transport justice. He's best known for his book, Transport Justice, Designing Fair Transportation Systems, which has been described by colleagues as groundbreaking, a landmark, and a revolution. While rooted in global north, in his more recent work, Martens is exploring transport injustice in the global south. Among others, jointly with global south scholars, he's studying how road design can encourage walking, how dignity can enhance paratransit, and how to employ transport justice in the practice of transport planning in Sub Saharan Africa. So at least we have somebody we've read, and today we want to listen to him live through online. So Martin, the floor is yours. I can see your PowerPoint clearly on. Hopefully everybody is seeing them as well. So
Great.
Welcome.
Thank you, Winnie. Thank you for your kind introduction, and thank you, VREF team, for hosting me and having me here. I feel it's like closing a circle. The first grant I ever received as a young researcher was from VREF in 2006, I think, and basically started my entire career on transport and justice. So VREF has played an important role in giving me the confidence that I was not just talking to myself, there was actually somebody listening out there and interested in what I started developing gradually over time. And today, I want to give a very broad brush about how the field has evolved and reflecting on how we, as academics, do research on the topic of transport and fairness, and what is maybe missing, and coming up with an appeal that maybe hopefully will also resonate with VREF as a very challenging ambition. So let me start with the introduction of the key terms. I would say fairness in transport. I want to use the very broad terms, so I can use the other terms in a minute. Equity and justice, which roughly mean the same thing. Fairness, equity, justice are three terms that roughly mean the same thing. But in the literature, they're used in different ways, and it's important. So I would say fairness in the domain of transport, since developed since the 50s, 60s, in the previous century, was hardly a topic. And only the last 20, 15 years, it became much more studied, and it became even a hot topic nowadays. I would say I cannot keep track of the literature, so many publications are published. But in thinking about fairness in transport, I would say there is a gradual shift from what I call equity to justice. And it's more like two terms to capture two very different approaches. So equity, I think, was more historically already in the late 80s, 90s. There were studies that used equity as a term, and basically had adopted a distributed perspective on transport. That ask how are different transport-related goods distributed over different population segments. And if you want to give it a formula, you could say these studies do the following. They ask how X, something, is distributed over a population Y in a city, a region, a country. And this population differentiated along a parameter Z. For instance, along gender, socioeconomic status, ethnicity, and so on. So a lot of the work that evolves from the late 90s onwards has taken this distributive perspective and asking, okay, how is something distributed over a population group if we look at this or this dimension of the difference between people. And here I just give a lot of possibilities for the X of what we're studying, what we might be interested in. And it ranges from fuel taxes, who's paying them, who's not paying them, who's paying more than their fair share, less than their fair share, crashes, satisfaction with travel, road infrastructure, and so on. There's a host of literature that's analyzing a variety of axes, you could say. And in all of them, equity is perceived from a distributed perspective. And so it's really about analyzing who gets more, who gets less. Often, equality is seen as the implicit standard, but in many cases, there is no standard of what is fair. We're just analyzing the pattern and saying this group has more, this group has less. And intuitively, if a disadvantaged group has less, that's a problem. And that is typically the case. And we tend to use equity, which is a more neutral term than justice. And we tend to use disparities, which sounds less dramatic than inequality. So we're kind of trying to stay neutral academic in this work. And just three studies to show that also today we still have this kind of studies, and I think they're important and they're valuable. And I don't want to dismiss them, definitely not. They put topics on the table. They challenge what's happening out there. But they also raise questions on how to move forward. And just one paper here on road safety, a very recent paper on how mass transit projects have different distributional impacts over different people. And I deliberately took away the author names here. Partly the studies are not from the Global South, definitely not from Sub Saharan Africa, but I took the names away because I don't want to offend anybody. That's not the intention. I just want to show there are lots of studies going on and they're valuable and they have their contribution. But they're different from justice. Taxing, transport fuel, a topic that was important and is becoming again important with electrification of the vehicle fleet. That's equity. Equity perceived as distribution, interested in the disparities between population groups. With very little thought typically about what would be a fair distribution. But transport justice as a concept, as a broad concept, developed by multiple authors, goes beyond distribution, I would argue. It frames the discussion very differently. And what it fundamentally does, it says transport is a domain of government intervention that is in a way comparable to other large domains of government intervention. And by doing that, there becomes a fundamental shift in thinking about transport and what we should analyze. Okay, and I want to draw a parallel with 3 other fields in which, certainly in the Global South, but also certainly in the Global North, but also in the Global South, thinking about justice is well developed. Housing, healthcare, and education. So these domains are very well developed, at least conceptually. We don't deliver in all dimensions as we maybe should, but there is a broad understanding of what justice means in this context. And there might be studies that analyze distributions, but it's always in the context of understanding the essence of each of these domains. And in housing, the essence is making sure everybody has a house, maybe of a minimal quality, but having housing. And we're not measuring exactly the square meters or whether everybody has a garden or a front and a back door. We're analyzing the essence. Did we succeed in providing everybody with a decent housing? In healthcare, there are studies analyzing, where are clinics, what's the match between doctors and patients. But in the essence, we understand it's really about what care people get and whether they get the same problem, gets the same care. And if this is the case, we consider it fair. And likewise in education, we do not analyze which kids have more books or larger classrooms. We're mostly interested in whether the schooling system pulls out the potential from the children as much as possible. And if we succeed in doing this, it's considered fairness. And so in each of these domains, we're very much aware of what is the essence of the domain. And the essence then shapes the distribution of all the other things. So when you talk about education, how many kids in a class? How many support kids from disadvantaged backgrounds maybe should get? How many schooling materials? Whether everybody deserves access to Wi-Fi and so forth. It all derives from this overarching goal of making sure all kids can fulfill their potential. Not the last 2 decades, there's been
we
a
almost
broad...
lost you, Carol. We almost lost you for some few seconds, but it's okay now.
Okay.
We lost.
Yeah, please warn me if it's, but if you cannot really warn me, Mark can send me a WhatsApp. He has my telephone number, so if it really gets troubling, I have no control over the technology, unfortunately.
No, it was very brief, very brief, maybe 20 seconds. All right.
Okay. Anyway, so the concept of transport justice basically asks from researchers and the broader society to think more fundamentally about transport, what the field of transport is supposed to give to people, broadly conceived. And I think over the last 20 years, there has developed a broad consensus, which developed from the late 1950s onwards. And if you trace it back, the concept of accessibility exists already more than 100 years. But gradually over time, there has been an agreement that accessibility is what transport is supposed to deliver. It's not about how close the bus stop is to you or how many road kilometers you have available to you. It is whether these services actually help you to get to places. And it's not just getting to the places you want to go to today, but it's about the range of places you can go to. And the range is essential. So it is not just where I'm going today, because where I'm going today may change tomorrow. I might lose my job. I want to have a new job. Today I'm studying. Tomorrow I want to work. Today I don't have children. Tomorrow I have children and I need to go to school, kindergarten, and so forth. Today I'm working, I have children in the home, and tomorrow I will be a senior and you have other needs. So it's really about a range of destinations you can reach. And in essence, accessibility is a very technical term for something very, very fundamental in society, which, at least in the West, is very much cherished, and I assume it's cherished everywhere around the world, which is freedom. Accessibility is a measure, a very technical measure of freedom. The more places you can reach, the more you have the freedom to decide what you want to do, what kind of job to take, which doctor to go to, what kind of study to follow, maybe what sports to engage in, which friends to meet, which family members not to meet, and which to meet, and so forth. And this makes accessibility, although technical, a very, very important and powerful concept. Now, I think the measuring accessibility patterns and the differences between people has become mainstream over the past 10, 15 years. And I'm just showing some examples of the type of work that I've been doing, typically comparing accessibility by different transport modes, typically focusing on jobs, but not only on jobs, also hospitals and other key services. There is a very broad literature measuring accessibility, and we'll get back to it in a minute. What is less studied and less agreed upon, and in this sense, many accessibility analyses are comparable to the equity studies, is a reluctance to say what accessibility patterns are fair or unfair. When do we see patterns which we think are unacceptable, and when do we think, oh, this city, this region actually delivers accessibility to all? So researchers are less inclined to make that explicit normative assessment. And that's, I think, my contribution, my most important contribution to the field, thinking systematically about what would mean fairness in accessibility. What is a fair pattern of accessibility when people do not receive their fair share of accessibility? And that's what I've done in my book, and I will not repeat here my philosophical argument for reasons of time. But the basic idea is that I used philosophies of justice and systematically thought about, if you don't know who you are, what kind of level of accessibility would you be willing to accept? So you have to think about a transport system, and you have to design the transport system that generates accessibility in some places and less so in other places. And what would you accept, not knowing where you will live in the real world? Now, not knowing where you will live in the real world, my assumption, my argument in the book is that you will not accept anything less than sufficient accessibility. Because insufficient accessibility will mean you will not be able to get a job, or go to school, or visit your family and friends, or go to shops even. That would be insufficient. It's a rough concept, but I'll get to it later on why it's useful. And so basically what the book tried to do is create another human right, another basic right on top of a right to housing, a right to healthcare, a right to education, which are well established. And the right to housing is even enshrined in more than 100 constitutions across the world, including many countries in the global south, which do not necessarily deliver, but realize, they cannot necessarily deliver at the moment, but realize that this is a fundamental right they should work towards. And so, in contrast, there is hardly or no comparable right in transport. And this is the principle I propose, a sufficient level of accessibility, and everybody is entitled to that. Now, the fundamental point is not here exactly what is sufficient, which is an empirical question, but the fundamental shift in how we think about transport. Because if you go to the transport field, how it developed since the late 50s, it basically focused on the transport system. It asked systematically, and it had developed tools to analyze whether the transport system is working well. Delivering analysis like this: a network, or in most cases a road network, but sometimes also a public transport network, analyzing whether the system could actually serve the demand for transport. What the transport justice discourse does, it changes radically the perspective away from the transport system, sees it only as a means to an end, and the end is people, delivering accessibility to all in their diversity. That's what transport justice is all about. And all the parts of the transport system should align: the bus stops, the lines, the frequencies, the roads, the bicycle paths, the pavements, the safe crossings should align to enable sufficient accessibility to all. Now, there are other alternative perspectives, obviously, because researchers do not necessarily agree that quickly and explore other perspectives. Now, from my perspective, these alternative philosophies ultimately arrive at a comparable principle. They are not fundamentally different, and I'm just mentioning them very briefly. You could start from basic needs. Basic needs for food, for clothing, for work, for education. You all need to get to those places. You can start from the social exclusion literature and wonder what is needed, what transport is needed to be included in society. Well, it will mean a certain level of connectivity to places which make you feel part of society, to jobs, education, to healthcare, and so on. There's a capability approach, which maybe pushes the standard higher. It says it's not just about the functionings, whether you have that job, but it's about the capability set. Can you choose for a job, or are you just stuck in that job? And there's a fundamental difference between being able to have a job or to choose a job. And as Amartya Sen always beautifully gives the example, there's a difference between fasting when you have food, or not eating when you cannot eat food. Although the functioning is the same, the capability is fundamentally different. Also, the capability approach thus demands access to places. A maybe more progressive approach even is relational egalitarianism, and it's currently developing, and I'm exploring it with a team member of mine, which sets the boundary even higher. It demands from society to create a society of equals. To be equal, it requires access to places, to be part of society, not to be second-rate citizen. And so in my perspective, all these perspectives, in a way, call for some minimum level of accessibility, some higher, some lower. They are not fundamentally different, even if the philosophical argument may be different. But they come up ultimately to the same principle, which then has to get an empirical basis. We'll talk about that in a minute. So far, I sketched the shift from transport equity, analyzing distributional patterns of many, many goods, to transport justice, analyzing whether the transport system as a whole delivers on its fundamental purpose, delivering accessibility to all. Now I want to reflect on how we study over the last 15 years, when the shift of transport justice has been happening, how we study transport, fairness, and justice. And I would say there's largely two problems in what's happening. And one I capture in the sentence, yes, but. Okay, and I'll explain in a minute what I mean. Yes, but. And the other is, we are great in diagnosis, and more diagnosis. And I'm part of that story, okay? Now, what do I mean with yes, but? Well, yes, but is basically a fundamental characteristic of an academic, right? We academics like to challenge past truths. And to quote a sentence from Konrad Lorenz, who won a Nobel Prize in the 70s, it is a good thing for a researcher to discard a pet hypothesis every day before breakfast. If you're a good researcher, the first thing you do is debunk what the guys before you said. Exactly. Say why it's wrong. This is our attitude as researchers, and it's also what pushes the field forward, of course. That's why we have an interesting debate. Yet. So what's happening in the literature, and I'm just talking about one dimension, is yes, we agree accessibility is the essence of transport. We agree about this. Definitely, you're completely right. And you were not the first one to say it anyway. And we can go back more than 100 years. And we can go back to Hansen, and we can go back to Savero, and so forth. And they all said it. But we should redefine accessibility to what? The obsession with jobs is wrong. We should think more about the set of activities that fit the person, their characteristics, their specifics. Not measure it in such a general way. We should account for the difference between people. It's not just about between modes. Okay, if you have a car, you have more accessibility, no car, less accessibility. It's not that simple. It matters who it is. Gender is important. Abilities are important. Age is important. We should all take this into account. Measuring accessibility is much more difficult than you think. And the accessibility measures you use are highly problematic. Simple cumulative accessibility measures. That's not how the world works. We should have other measures. Maybe gravity-based measure, discounts an opportunity if it's farther away. Or maybe we should take into account competition. It's great to have many jobs available, but if there's many people looking for jobs, what's the value of that job? What's the value of accessibility? It's not. We should maybe take into account the time people have available. Some people have a small time window. They have caretaking duties. It should be measured too. Maybe more fundamental. This objective measurement doesn't mean anything. People don't live like this. People do not know about these opportunities. It's about perceived accessibility, because this is what people can really choose from. We should measure something entirely different. And maybe the most fatal critique is say, okay, there are many ways to measure, and if we cannot agree, the problem is that different ways of measuring lead to different problems, and so different policy questions. And so maybe we cannot move forward. We're not sure what is the problem. Now, I don't think these are unimportant questions. I think they are important. I think this is the role of academic research. But I would like the researchers to frame it differently. I would like them to say, yes, transport justice, this idea that transport is an important field of government intervention, and its purpose is to deliver access for all. Yes, we embrace that. And, not but, and we will add to that. We will enrich it. We will improve it. We will make it better. So I explicitly embrace the agenda I would call on researchers, and I will get back to it, why this is so important. I would like them to reconstruct the agenda, improve it, rather than deconstruct what's wrong with it. And I would like them to be pragmatic. Yes, there's many ways to measure accessibility, but can we actually have the data to do that? And if not, what would be the second best option you can live with that is actually measurable in the particular context you're working in? Be pragmatic. That's my first call on the research community. Let's see yourself as a community and work together towards something that is better, rather than trying to disprove each other. I'll get back to this, why this is important in a minute. The second is, we need to go from diagnosis to intervention. We are great in diagnosis. Excellent. That was equity in transport was all about. And transport justice, much of the empirical work is also about diagnosis, about analyzing what is the problem. What are the differences in accessibility? And I'm just showing one map from Buenos Aires, from colleagues from Italy and Chile, who analyzed equality, inequality in accessibility to jobs in Buenos Aires, and clearly showing a pattern that you would expect. High in the center and low outside the center with high inequalities. I'm doing the same work, okay? I analyze it for US cities, and I found these patterns. Now, what I do add is I just not only analyze inequalities, I put a standard of sufficient accessibility, and then say, it's not only unequal, there's also a lack of accessibility. And this is a map of the hotspots. In Atlanta is nearly entirely unfair. A very tiny area close to the city center has enough accessibility for those people without a car, and everything outside is insufficient. And these are the places, marked in black here, where many people live who don't have enough accessibility. Great. Nice work. Now what do we do? Now, even in the simple case of Amsterdam, which I also analyzed, where you would say from far away, yes, right, the region of Amsterdam, great public transport, you have bicycles, accessibility must be great. Well, if you analyze it carefully, it's not. And actually, if you don't have public transport, the entire periphery of the region lacks sufficient accessibility, even though we take the jobs outside the region into account. Okay, great diagnosis. What do we do now? Just take one zone, this zone, deep blue color, meaning it has really lacks lots of accessibility, and it has a large population that is affected by it. Now, how do we improve their accessibility? Should we make a better link to the city center of Amsterdam, or to the airport of Schiphol, where there's many jobs, or maybe just to the town next door, where there are also jobs, or to towns outside of my region? Basically, we don't know, and we didn't develop the tools to even start thinking about it. And my argument would therefore be, we should move away. We should not move away from diagnosis. No. Diagnosis is key. It remains important. And there's no but here. There's only an and here. Diagnosis is key, and we need three things. One is, we should do empirical work to figure out what would be a reasonable standard for sufficient accessibility. Social exclusion literature develops in that direction, is only poorly linked to accessibility, but it maps really insufficiency in a qualitative way. That's one thing we need to do. We need to develop new tools to identify promising interventions. Which of these interventions I showed in Amsterdam are the most effective, most efficient? We need tools to do so. They don't exist at the moment. And once we have identified promising interventions, we also need to assess their value to society. We only have limited budgets. We have to make choices. What is the most effective and efficient investment? We need to develop these tools. Now, let me conclude. I hope I'm on time. If I look back at the last 15 years, where thinking about fairness in transport has emerged as a dominant strand of research among transport researchers, certainly those with a social science leaning, but I see more and more people in the hard part of the transport domain who do optimization, operations research, who are getting into equity questions too. If I look at it, I see good things and things that we need to develop further. So one is, the shift is happening. We're moving away from equity and doing our little studies of what is distributed in what way, to actually building up a corpus of knowledge on what is transport justice in, what is justice in the domain of transport, and what could it look like, and how can we study it. I see a growing academic community doing research on this and having the research skills to ask the right questions and do the right work. But I also see an academic community that is very much focused on academic output, meaning telling what the other guy did wrong and proposing an alternative that is supposedly better. Academic output that often doesn't go outside the academia, that doesn't go to practitioners, that is not adopted or embraced by practitioners. And I see a community that is very much focused on internal debate, disagreement between us, focusing on definition questions, measurement issues, and so forth. I think we have to do much better if we want to make a change, if we are not just here for academic career or for doing research, but we also think that this agenda of transport justice has a social meaning, has social importance, and I think we all think this is the case. Then we have to do something more. And I want to take you for a minute to the US and to explain very briefly why transport planning got off its rail. And it's described in this book by Weiner. Published already a first version in the 70s, no, I think in the 80s, sorry, and now it's fifth edition, describing the history of transport planning in the US. Why is the US important? Because what happened in the US basically was adopted in Europe and in the rest of the world, including Sub Saharan Africa. And what it describes is an enormous effort of the US government to develop a practice of transport planning that was widely shared, where there was lots of expertise. That became a standard practice. They spent 15 years of developing guidelines, having seminars, trainings, explanations, pilot projects, exhibit projects to establish a standard approach to transport planning. That approach is the approach that focuses on the system and never asks whether people are being served. But the important thing to learn from this is that if a community is willing to focus and develop jointly an approach they can agree upon, despite disagreements in the margin, you can set a standard that can then be adopted in practice and will be implemented till today. Now, if we realize that this is what it takes, this is what we should do. And so I want to draw a last parallel with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, where I don't know exactly what is the history of it, but the panel brings together scientists from across the world to basically study jointly climate change and come to an agreement on what is happening with our climate and what we can expect in the future. They have lots of disagreements. They use different methods. They measure things in different ways. They will not always agree with each other, but they understand the importance of coming to an agreement, because there has to be a clear message to governments that something needs to be done, because they do agree, 99% of all academics, that climate change is happening and it's going to have dramatic impacts. Now, this idea of setting up a community that, despite disagreements and different perspectives and different backgrounds and different philosophical starting points, is willing to work for a greater social good, I think is what we should embrace in Africa. Because I think Africa has not so much yet embraced the US approach to transport planning, which is disastrous, which is the cause of the inequalities and injustices we see in transport. It's the cause. Now, because Africa has not fully embraced it, has not yet completely adopted it in everyday practice, it can be changed. And so I call on the community here, and I reach out to the VREF too, to set up what I call a Pan-African community on transport justice, where jointly we'll work to develop an alternative to the classical way of transport planning, which is not only outdated, but disastrous for society. I think Africa can lead the way precisely because it's still a young country, young continent in its development of the transport system. It can develop an alternative if all the bright minds on the continent sit together and start working towards something very, very different, that from the very start will deliver accessibility to all. I end with that. Thanks for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Karel. I'm sure if we were live, everybody's hands would be going up, and I think we need to have our hands up indeed. This was really, really good. Very, very informative. And I think people have listened to even forgetting that they should be putting things on chat. It was more of listening, but I think now it's time just not to listen, but to chat. And I think there is one or two questions there. But I'm just wondering, Martin, if we look at your argument of accessibility and basing it on spatial data, I would think that a lot of countries tend to attempt to embrace that. But I'm wondering whether there is a threshold for the indicators that one can load to assess whether there is accessibility at a practical sense, if we are to think of applying some of these frameworks on the ground. There are many. You've highlighted that really we have to think through and we can keep tweaking it as per need. But the most common usually is spatial. In recent times, there is a little bit of attempt of trying to recognize other parameters, but a lot of people look at just spatial, where people are living, where is the location, and that kind of stuff. it would just be good to reflect a bit, especially if in your works across the world, you've engaged with some of that. And
Well,
as we continue to get more people engaging in this discussion.
What the concept of accessibility has two dimensions. One is a transport system and the other is land use patterns.
Yes.
And I think one of the challenges in the Sub-Saharan African context is that land use patterns tend to be very, very concentrated. Opportunities tend to be very, very concentrated. And only improving the transport system will not bring accessibility, sufficient accessibility to all. With sprawling cities expanding and expanding and people settling on the outskirts of the city. If we do not change in African cities our urban structure, it will be very, very difficult, if not impossible. But in order to enable that, also requires thinking very differently about your transport system. Employment is willing to locate where accessibility is high, where they can reach many, many workers, and vice versa, also where they can reach many, many consumers and clients. And so if you should think about a different transport system also from that perspective, meaning it should be much less centralized, focus on the historical center, and just distribute it more. And I think one of the challenges, I mean, I'm speaking from a global north experience. That's my experience I know, where I think it's really about fundamental changes in the transport system itself, moving away from car-based investments, which go on till today, towards a systematic investment in walking, cycling, and public transport. And I think in a Western global North context, it is possible to move gradually towards sufficient accessibility by mostly focusing on the transport system. I think in an African context, where you have multiple challenges, including very fast population growth, especially in cities, and very concentrated land use patterns, you need to work on all dimensions, which makes it much more difficult. And that's why you need a committee of all the minds together to think of an approach of how to do things differently. Because if you repeat the approach, you will just strengthen the transport corridors to the center. Because the standard model will tell you that's where the congestion is. Congestion is the problem. You should eliminate congestion. And so all BRT lines, even if you decide not to build roads, but BRT, will go to the center. And they will strengthen that pattern, which basically makes it impossible for you to deliver sufficient accessibility on the edges of these growing cities. Something else is needed, different investments.
Thank you very much. Catherine Gatteri, I think you can articulate, since there are not so many charts, you can articulate what you just raised on the chart to just go ahead. Catherine Gatteri, go ahead.
Thank you, Professor. I was just contributing on to what Mark has said. We do so much diagnosis. We have all these issues laid out, but I think a lot of it remains in the research agenda. But we do not have the policymakers really taking up the research or implementing that. And I think what Dado has just said, that maybe we need to move now more from the research and to bring in the policymakers to be able to implement that research, because it is a lot. And in the African context, I know we have so much we've done regarding justice issues, regarding equity, but it does not translate really to implementation. And when it translates into implementation, we are seeing very many actors in the sector. You will have the World Bank implementing a bit of it in one city or in one town. Then we have another body like European Union implementing a small component. And I think what Mark is saying, an IPCC where we have all of us on board and everybody is doing the right thing, which is the equity aspect and the justice. How do we bring all this research into action? Thank you, Winnie.
Thank you very much. Obed Bore, your hands is up. You will have a number, just maybe 2, 3, then you can go at it, Martin. Obed, go ahead, please. Obed, yeah, go ahead.
Hi, you can hear me, Prof?
Yes, I can hear you.
Right. Just also in addition to Catherine's points and my colleagues' points here, thank you, Prof, for the presentation. You see, most of the African cities already some sort of urban plan. So those urban planning were done templates from US or somewhere in UK. Going to the ahead. It will mean that there's a whole overhaul. How do we connect the policymakers, the planners, the practitioners? Because I think it will be a very difficult job to really convince and push for the implementers of the planning that is already available to start over and put this new paradigm. It's quite a task, and it means there is a lot of push from everyone, including the academia and all that. So I think the call for action is on that line. Perhaps you can add more, the presenters can add more nuggets on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And just last but not least, as you look at those, I think in your conclusion, you talk about gradual shift from equity to justice. And I'm wondering whether this shift to justice, I know that social justice is a component of the broader concept of justice, but don't you think that kind of shift can also make, contribute to a bit of marginalization of what we search for in social justice? Or could we assume that when you talk about, shifting from equity to justice, we mean all the components of justice? Because what we are struggling with at a practical sense is that we talk of justice and every country has embraced that. But at a practical sense, they're really not going to look, few are really getting into capturing the social justice aspect of it, which we are going to be hearing in the discussion soon. Thank you. You can get ahead, and I think that will be it, because our time, we are eating into our 5 minutes break for time.
Okay. So a very brief response. You could say that the International Panel on Climate Change is not a successful example, right? They do affect the policymakers, but it also shows how difficult it is to affect policymakers, even if you agree as a scientific community that something needs to be done, or at least you agree that climate change will have tremendous impacts. I think that professionals do have a strong voice in decision making, in shaping how people think about transport. I think that although there are academic studies showing inequities, the tools that are available and used at the moment to analyze the problems highlight different problems than the inequities and injustices. They are not systematically geared to map these, and they're not systematically geared to understand how solutions can address them. The tools are very different. And this means that decision makers not only have their own mindset, which tends to be a car-oriented mindset, because they obviously have their own cars and they drive cars and that's how they see the world, but they're also being fed by professionals that repeat the same message. It's not just politicians saying that we need more roads, it's the transport profession that says we need more roads. And roads, not roads that will have a special lane for transit and a bike lane. It says more roads, and congestion is a problem. And so it's really about, if we as a community manage to formulate an alternative, and it will be difficult. It will be difficult because it took in the US also 15 years to develop the approach after they spent literally millions of dollars in 1950 dollars. So that will be like 10 million now or more on huge studies. Okay, it's a huge effort to change the perspective and to develop a system. But it can be done as a community, it can be done. But it's really about developing an alternative way of analyzing and proposing and assessing solutions. It is not just knowing that you should do something else.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you really, really much. We appreciate this discussion. It's very useful to all of us. And I think right now we just want to, maybe you will get down your PowerPoints and then all of us can have a break of 5 minutes. Make sure you are back at 5 past the hour, wherever you are locating from, 5 past the hour. I've reduced it from 10 minutes to 5 because we ate into it because we loved to listen to Carol. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. So we get back in another 5 minutes, and in the interim, my pack of 3, don't overtake your coffee or tea, because very soon I'll be calling upon you in another 5 minutes. Thanks.
Thank you, Winnie. I will be there.
Thank you. Sure. Okay, I think we are all back to the scene. We can get back again. For those who are still coming, they'll get us on. And we are going to have the three. And what I'm going to do is just to briefly give you their CVs, all of the CVs at once. And then when we start the presentations, we are going to start with Dr. Ann Kamau, then we go to Professor Max Sudgest, and then we finish with Violet Wawire. And then after that, I'll briefly give a bio of the commentators, and then they'll bang in. So I'll just go through, and in the interim, Ann Kamau, you can be posting your PowerPoints as I give a brief of you. Dr. Ann Kamau is a senior research fellow at the Institute for Development Studies of the University of Nairobi. She is a medical sociologist involved in research and teaching in the areas of transport, health, social policy, and development. Ann's areas of transport research include children travel and mobility, social just public transport, and future work in public transport and gender. She also has worked on cashless payments in public transport and active mobility. She is also a beneficiary of VREF Mobility and Access African Cities program, MAC program, 2019-2020. She led a project on urban spaces, design, mobility, and transport safety of children, which was a comparative study of Nairobi and Kumasi city. She is currently involved in a collaborative for active mobility in Africa, KAMA project, which focuses on walking and cycling. She also recently supported a study on public transport fleet renewal and electric mobility in Kenya. So that is Ann Kamau, Dr. Ann Kamau, and then Dr. Mark Sudgest is a Sanral endowed chair of transport planning and engineering and head of Department of Civil Engineering at University of Cape Town in South Africa. He is a B-rated researcher with the National Research Foundation of South Africa. He's a civil engineer by training from the Netherlands and has a PhD from the Netherlands Research School for Transport, Infrastructure, and Logistics. Mark is also the co-editor-in-chief for the Elsevier Journal of Transport Geography and founder and deputy editor-in-chief for the Elsevier Africa Transport Studies, AFTRAN. Together with his UCT colleagues and the VREF, he is a founder of the African Transport Research Conference. Mark's research focuses on development and application of quantitative techniques for the modeling and assessment of transport systems in the context of developing countries. He has visited and worked in more than 25 African countries in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. He has published widely over 40 peer-reviewed journal, conference proceedings, and book chapters. And just to note, he started in 2005 as a young researcher who had received a small grant project grant from VREF, which kickstarted his scientific career. So it's really good that he's still now mentoring others after being kickstarted as a young scholar. Thank you for that. Last but not least, we have Violet Wawire, who has worked as a lecturer at the Kenyatta University School of Education for the last 15 years. Her areas of specialization are gender, social inclusion, and development in Africa, as well as qualitative research approaches. Her past themes of research has been on the nexus between gender, disability, youth, and education, trade, transport, and green skills building. She has vast local and international consultancy experience in evaluation work with NGOs and donor organizations, including the Ford and the Carnegie Foundations, among others. She is an accomplished author with numerous journal papers and book chapters on gender and intersectionality and development. Her latest book chapter publication is on researching with children and young adults with disabilities in Kenya. So we have a team of three that is very equipped to be the lead presenters in this forum. So Ann Kamau, you have your 15 minutes to go, so you can start your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Winnie, and I hope that you can see my screen.
I can see them. I hope the rest are seeing as well.
Thank you very much. So I am presenting on the social justice principle as an instrument for studying public transport equity in Sub-Saharan Africa. And I want to begin by noting that while the focus is on public transport, I will not go into really trying to distinguish what public transport is, especially within the African context, because the way it is understood in the African context could be different from the way it is understood elsewhere. But we'll just assume that we are talking about transport that is available to the public. So this is what that is a kind of definition or understanding that I'm going to use here. So now when we think about, so I will explore the concept of social justice as a conceptual tool for studying equity in public transport, and then dive into the conceptual frameworks. Not many, there are quite a number in the literature, but I'm only borrowing two for today's presentation that brings out aspects of social justice and equity, and then reflect on social justice in the Sub-Saharan African context. So I'm going to perhaps repeat quite a bit of what has already been said by Karel. So pardon me if you find me repeating, but again, I will try not to repeat as much. But beginning by the concept of social justice, we do fairly understand when you look through literature, it is used in many ways without no definite definition in terms of what it is. But there's an agreement that it's really about fair treatment and equitable status for all individuals, regardless of what their social background is or who they are in a society. And if we find statements like social just or good or just being used to refer to social justice. So the literature is really broad on this. And also the bigger question again is the question of equity or equal. What is equal is presumed also to be good and just. So again, a bit of semantics, but this is what we find in the literature. Therefore, from where we think about social justice within the Sub-Saharan Africa, then would expect that then social justice here would mean something that is equitable, whether it's public transport that is equitable, fair, and just for all. And the lack of this then will breed inequality and injustice, especially for the vulnerable and underrepresented population groups. So this is the general understanding of what social justice is, and even as we embrace it in public transport. So it's about equalness for all, whether in terms of access, rights, and opportunities that are provided for all, regardless of whatever intersectionality dynamics we look at. So again, already mentioned by Winnie and also by Karel, is about the different types and the many subtypes of justice itself. The justice is a broad word, and there are many subtypes of or subcategories of what is defined as justice. Again, the literature has a lot in terms of what then this is, but I'll pick again only two that just to illustrate what are the different subsectors that you might be thinking about, or subcategories that you might be thinking about when you refer to public transport and social justice. Of course, the distributive aspect, which has more to do with also access and physical and financial access. So issues of cost, coming, procedural justice, and how we influence public space and use in terms of, access. The interaction aspect of social justice, which I found to be quite interesting, which has to do with the quality of social interaction. So when we look, for example, across Africa and the way people move in public transportation systems, what is the nature of interaction? Is it that maybe they're struggling to get maybe in a vehicle, or do they get into a vehicle in a very nice and happy mode that now we can see here we're building very good quality of social interaction, or people fighting for space within this public transport system? Again, the informational aspect of social justice, which has to do with adequate information and signage. This is very critical for us. Sub-Saharan Africa has enough and many languages. How do you move from a village in Ghana to a village in Cameroon and use either French and maybe you are old, so you only perhaps understand your local language. How do we ensure that people have access to information as they move across public transport systems within Africa or Sub-Saharan Africa for that matter? Again, the issue of representation, whether people feel recognized in the public transport systems itself, do they feel like this is our public transport system or it is their public transport system? How do people feel about this? And the issue of representation also includes the workers themselves. Do they really feel that they're part of the system itself? Because maybe part of what we see, like the road traffic crashes that we see, could be about people not really feeling like this is my vehicle. Maybe it's someone else's vehicle, so I can drive the way I want. So but the outcomes that we see, do we relate to the social justice elements? Then the ethic of care, which I've also found to be quite interesting, is the degree to which people are encouraged by others, to care for others. When we see people struggling to get into a vehicle, how much are we using the ethics of fair concept in terms of promoting social justice within the public transport systems? And there's recognition and restoration and many others that we find in the literature. So I will very quickly go over then, when given this kind of a background, then what can we summarize as really social justice when it comes to public transportation and how it has been used even in the literature? And there's a lot that one can read. So first of all, we would want to look at public transportation as a public space. Therefore, it's a space within which maybe vehicles use, whatever other means people travel on, whether it's a train or whichever. So we are using subspace. How well is this transport corridor established? Do we have potholes that will cause accidents? How well are we applying the social justice principle in the spaces that we are using as transport corridors? Then do we see this as a public good, where we are looking at societal flourishing and improving social interactions and connection in society? Is it about road safety policies that we have? I think already that was mentioned by Karel. Again, the issue of inclusion and equity also has been mentioned, and the issue of universal access is really one of those that has really been raised again a lot in the literature. So you will find this. So we also do recognize that it is part of the Sustainable Development Goals. So we cannot talk about social justice with also not public transport also without referring to SDGs, and especially SDG 11 target 2. And here, a socially just public transport, if I may call it like this, is considered to be one that is adequate, reliable, safe public transport system. And that then we can measure by looking at, what is the level of access, safety, and affordability among citizens in terms of public transport systems. Again, is it about expansion? But again, literature also argues that it's not just about expanding the public transport infrastructure alone, but also about ensuring that more people are able to use this infrastructure, because we can also have infrastructure that is not used perhaps because there are no vehicles, or where the infrastructure is, people have to really go down hills and valleys before they can access that infrastructure. So again, how then do we ensure also we close this gap, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa, where only 1 in 3 people actually are said to have access to convenient public transport modes. So, and the UN also uses the aspect of convenience as a form of measurement. So I'm going to just give two what I would call the frameworks that have been used. One is a slow-cut wheel on transport and the SDGs. And this one focuses more on livelihoods and socioeconomic recovery, issues of social justice, which also the other one also uses generally issues of universal access, affordability, and reliability, and being people-centered. And here it's more about poverty, focusing also on poverty in an inequitable manner, focusing on poverty and vulnerability. So, and I would say that when you think about equity, then and social justice, these are two words already like explained by Karel that many times are difficult to separate, that many times we find ourselves using social justice and equity. But of course, there would be some specific indicators of what really is equitable, what is equity, and the slow-cut wheel attempts to bring out the aspect of equity. It's about human rights access. It's about women and girls. Issues of safety, of course, come in here. planning, infrastructure and finance, and innovations, and issues of productivity and jobs. So we can look further into this. Because of time, I will not go too much into this. So, but really, this is worth referring to. But of course, this will also include aspects of health, greening. Green, of course, has to be sustainability and resilience. But again, the focus for me for today is just on the equitable component of the wheel, but I believe that others can also explore other aspects of this wheel. Then we have, from what we've been working on since 2019 ourselves, I've been part of the team working with the Friedrich Ebert Foundation or Stiftung on the social just public transport itself. And here again, we try to really ask if we were to go to government and tell them that we really want a socially just public transport system, for example, in Kenya or within Sub Saharan Africa, what is the minimum that we can ask from them? And part of what we put here is also part of what Karel talked about and also what we mentioned earlier. But in our view, we thought that this a socially just public transport that is inclusive for all, and should be first of all available, it should be accessible, and affordability also comes in here, inclusiveness comes in here. It must be sustainable, but more importantly for today is that must embrace human rights and equity. And for us, the issues of equity here again have to do with non-discriminatory practices. It must be safe, and then we must ensure that this public transport is available everywhere, both in the rural and the urban areas, both in the former urban central areas and also in the better developed areas, that it is generally accessible, and it promotes travel decency amongst the people that use it. So then we can say then we are creating the quality of movement or mobility that we are looking for. So I want to just use this to really ask then, if this is understanding of social justice and equity, if we look at how children travel, and I will use just one slide from a study that we did with the University of Cape Coast in Ghana that was supported by VREF in 2019 and 2020, then we ask, is the way children travel in the public transport systems, does it embrace aspects of justice and equity? So we know that, and this study was an urban study context, so you might find the population of walking or whichever is like public transportation is higher. But if you go to the rural areas, perhaps the bar on walking and would be much, much higher, and very small on public transportation. So these are the cities in Kumasi and Nairobi. But then we find that even when a very small proportion of these children use public transportation, it is still not child-friendly. We've seen across Africa the kind of road carnage that we've seen involving school children, for example. So many children are dying across Africa. What is the problem with the public transportation system that is moving children to school or from school? Is there a social justice element? Is it about policy? Is it about equity that maybe no one really is looking at the transport system that children are using? So as I come towards maybe the end, I would want to go back, and I know Karel said the issues of social justice are very old, and I do agree. I would go back to Tony, 1934, and Tony looked at social justice from an education perspective, and you know that within the education field, the socially just education terminologies have really been widely used, whether in reference to curriculum reforms, pedagogy and teaching, or leadership practices in education. But according to Tony, he says that the only basis of educational policy worthy of a civilized nation is one which accepts as its objective the establishment of the completeness, possible educational equality, and it is a duty of such educationalists to agree with that view to make clear by definite, explicit, and repeated statements. Very big, many words that perhaps may not really mean much at the moment. But the issue is then to really ask, and of course the word civilization and civilized, of course, this was 1934, also can be contested. But again, when you take that statement and apply it in the transportation sector, the words then that I would pick are the issues of that when you think about public transportation in Sub-Saharan Africa, we need to look at the society having completeness possible of public transport equality. So how complete is our public transport systems? in order to enhance equality, and that it is a duty of all of us, such specialists, as agree with what view to make it clear, definite, explicit, and repeated statements. And when I qualify that, I would also want to quote Engineer Dairo, who is from Nigeria and really worked with Ramata. And in 2019, we had a meeting, and I really liked what Engineer Dairo said. And he said that the social justice is a reflection of civilization and what we should all subconsciously expect in any society in the 21st century. So it means that as we grow up, as we raise children in the public transport system, we should create some subconsciousness of what should be the minimum expectation of what a socially just public transport should be like. Therefore, it means that we must have this consciousness and it's a conscious effort to really push for socially just public transport systems, that we must really look at our public transport policies to ensure that they're equitable for all, and that from where we come from, we must make the decision, make it very clear. This is a minimum in terms of social justice that we might expect. We must be definitive about what it is that we expect in terms of social justice, socially just public transport. It must be explicit, and we must do it repeatedly. And that nothing less of this should be actually the desired. So, and I think this is what I would want to leave you with when we think about then what is social justice within public transport in Sub-Saharan Africa. It is not possible for me to go to each one of the countries in Sub-Saharan Africa or generally because of time. But again, then we are saying that social justice in public transport is a societal responsibility. It is a responsibility of all. When children are dying, it should be everybody's concern. Again, it's about addressing inequalities, public transport, which are often reproduced and reproduced. And again, it's about addressing the inequities in the public transport itself, especially for the underserved populations, and that it's about need for equal and fair public transport systems in Sub-Saharan Africa, that it doesn't matter whether I'm in Nairobi, in Accra, in Bujumbura, that we should all access some minimum standard public transport across Africa. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anne. That's really, really illuminating how we must look into the issue of social justice with a new lens and seeing Africa really irrespective of the borders. What is it that we want? I can see a lot as in the interim, Mark, you can be loading your PowerPoints as I just briefly tell the audience that I'm seeing a lot of engagement, which is very encouraging. But what is missing in those engagements, I'm not seeing people putting what they think should be done. So we are also encouraging you to get out of those academic jackets and be those policymakers you are referring to and propose some things. What is it? What is it? What is it that you do? If tomorrow you end up being that governor or that president, what is it that could be done in all these debates we are having in the chat? So feel free to make some suggestions and they're good. We always collect these discussions and going forward, they inform our discussions and thinking and even planning. So thank you very much. I can see Mark is already on board. So Mark, you can go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you so much, Vinny. Can you hear me?
Yes, very clearly.
All right, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak in this important seminar. And also thank you so much for the introduction earlier. And I hope that the audience realizes that I'm just an engineer. Because when Karel was presenting, there were at least 4 moments that I wanted to throw my PowerPoint away and go home. But let's have a discussion. Yeah, really what I'm going to present to you today is a few examples which Karel was criticizing a little bit. So more in the diagnostics sphere, looking at equity and distributional perspectives. But what I am trying to do is to look at specific user groups in our societies, in Africa's or in the developing country societies. And so that will be the focus of my presentation, titled Measuring Transport Equity in Low-Income Societies, a Capability Approach. And also, before I forget, congratulations to the VREF for five great years of MEC program, and also my colleagues of the Center for Transport Studies here, that we have benefited a lot. We hope we have contributed a lot as well. So thank you for that. So when we look at the needs of vulnerable low-income users, we know that they are actually, and I think the previous two speakers spoke to that already, is they are not adequately represented through our current transport planning paradigms. So our paradigms are very much car and congestion focused, and these perspectives have only more recently received the right attention in academic literature, not the least because of the VREF programs that we're discussing today. So barriers to transportation for people in low-income societies, as you know, are multifaceted, are complex. They range from social to cultural issues through the lack of technical capacity, at least the technical capacity that we need to address this, and even legacy institutional arrangements. So when we look at the current way of doing a needs assessment, they are very much limited to infrastructure perspectives that planners and quantitative techniques that are supporting the way planners look at these technical issues. So that is our 4-step models, the level service approach and congestion and other things. So our models, also the models that I teach, by the way, because that's what we do, are very car dominated and actually require a lot of data. So in our context of lesser developed countries, data is another issue that is contributing to the problems that we see, especially if you want to start modeling and analyzing vulnerable groups of people, for example, using informal modes to go to informal places. Such data hardly exists. So the current practices largely fail to acknowledge these needs of the less visible actors in the transport systems. They largely fail to acknowledge the locations of these vulnerable users in the city, and so we need to come up with different and new frameworks and techniques. So I've been using the last few years the frameworks and techniques that Karel Martens developed. Actually, we have been collaborating in this, in allowing for at least trying to do similar type of transport equity analysis, hoping to turn them into transport justice analysis in the end of the day to take place. So what I would like to do is I would like to give you 3 examples under the heading of what we call the capability approach, which in my view is very much adopting this distributive perspective that Karel was talking about, and show you how they can be used to measure transport equity in our societies. And actually all 3 examples, they directly or indirectly stem from VREF sponsored projects. So this is my only theoretical slide, and then I will move into the 3 examples immediately. So this slide starts with a phrase that we call proximity is not access. And I think that is very important, because for most vulnerable groups in our societies, proximity is first of all not a reality. The urban poor tend to live far away from opportunities, or even moved away from opportunities, as one of my examples will show you. And second of all, proximity is not access. Proximity to public transport does not mean that people can actually afford to ride a public transport mode. Proximity to services does not necessarily mean it is disability friendly. Proximity to destinations does not mean personal safety and security, for example. So whatever mobility and accessibility analysis that we do, we should make sure that they are inclusive of its users, the people, and as Amartya Sen calls it, their ability to do and to be. So in this capability approach, which is kind of the framework that I'm working with today, the term capabilities refers to the collective set of options that a particular person or group of persons can choose from. Functionings is the subset of these capabilities, so the various things that a person or a group of persons realizes or achieves. In other words, action. And the resources here, and I'm distinguishing 2 types of resources, are goods and services available. So on the one hand, I call them place-based resources, so that's your locations where job, healthcare, and other opportunities are based, but also where people live, as well as mobility resources. In other words, the infrastructure and the transport modes that people have available. So knowing which resources are available is not sufficient to know which functionings an individual can achieve, obviously. So mediating between the resources that people have access to and the capabilities they can achieve are what we call conversion factors, which can be personal, social, spatial, and environmental, and can act as both barriers or facilitators to someone's functioning. I will concentrate mostly today on personal and spatial conversion factors, both acting as barriers or as facilitators. So in the examples, I will concentrate on different socioeconomic and physical barriers. For example, I will specifically look at low-income dwellers who are clearly more sensitive to, for example, public transport fares than middle-income or high-income travelers. Furthermore, low-income earners tend to live further away from place-based job resources, and these will then be called barriers. Facilitators, on the other hand, will then be factors that enable someone's capability, such as the introduction of a new mode, maybe a BRT, a bus rapid transit, or a new paratransit route in an area, a universally accessible urban design, or a subsidy of some sort. So in my examples, I will try to demonstrate how these conversion factors affect capabilities and potential functioning of the urban poor, the focus point of my 3 examples. And I will concentrate on locational disadvantages in Cape Town, in the first example, disparities to income and affordability, also in Cape Town, in the second example. And then I will move to India, and I know it's an African seminar, but we did some fascinating work in India where you can show what kind of facilitators can actually change someone's functionings in terms of access to opportunities. And I will be specifically looking at a social housing scheme and the introduction of a new transport mode in Ahmedabad, India. In all 3 cases, I will use GIS, mapping, and modeling to study these. So the first example in Cape Town, I call that the place-based capabilities example. I would like to show how place-based factors, places of employment, vis-a-vis places of living, as well as mobility factors, so access to a minibus taxi or a train or a car, affect capabilities of the transport users in inner cities such as Cape Town. I will particularly look in its application at the vulnerable low-income commuters who, and I think all of you know, in part due to the history of apartheid spatial planning, typically live far away from employment opportunities and solely rely on public transport, both formal and informal modes, to commute to their destinations. So if I use Karl Martin's transport justice framework, which you see in this slide, you see a set of axes just juxtaposed that indicate potential accessibility levels as well as potential mobility levels. So potential accessibility is then the range of job opportunities that one can reach from a particular point in the city, whereas potential mobility is what the modal availability and the ease of moving to those opportunities of a person in a certain location is. We distinguish 4 modes, and we look at, for ease of the argument, at the speed of the average speed of these modes, including access and egress. We then group the different areas, which in a highly segregated Cape Town is actually equal to different socioeconomic or socio-demographic groupings, from low to high levels of potential accessibility and mobility. Then where these 2 axes intersect lies at the average level of such mobility and accessibility, which Karel in his book calls the sufficiency thresholds, below which there is a severity of accessibility and or mobility deficiency. So my focus now will be on who resides and or what modes are in this lower quadrant, the low quadrant of insufficient accessibility and mobility. So we are not looking at specific roads or specific levels of congestion. We are now looking at the people in which areas are not having access to sufficient levels of accessibility and mobility. So to do that, we look at the various modes in a GIS model. So just imagine that this is that access system. So what I'm doing here is for each of the 1,786 areas in Cape Town, I'm plotting what access a car user would have to reach a range of job opportunities. So if you have access to a car, how many job opportunities could you potentially reach? That's what you see within 60 minutes. That is what you see on the vertical axis, and then on the horizontal axis you see about what is the average speed at which people using a car could use these opportunities. So more or less what you see is an average of 1.1 job opportunities in the city, reachable by traveling at an average speed of 50 to 60 kilometers per hour. Let's not have a discussion about the accuracy of that speed indication, but what I want you to see is what the difference is if you look at other modes. Suppose you don't have a car available. So in the second part of the analysis, I'm showing you what our local train, and that's actually before the system collapsed entirely, what the local train, its schedules and routes, how that is contributing to delivering potential accessibility and mobility in the city. And you can already see that actually, because obviously of the system and where and who's connected and who is not connected to the system, you can see that numbers of opportunities to reach jobs are much lower, at about 300,000 potential jobs at an average speed of 30 kilometers per hour. If I'm now looking at our bus rapid transit system, you actually see two things. You see less circles, so there are fewer areas that actually can enjoy the BRT simply because the system is not extensive at all. And despite that, despite having dedicated infrastructure, you can actually see that on average, it's not even providing that much opportunities in terms of jobs as well as average speed. But now the interesting thing comes if we then add our minibus taxi, our paratransit system, which to most of our urban poor people is the lifeline of the lifeline of mobility in the cities. You see that even though slightly less than car and slightly slower than car because of its public transport nature, it is still providing a phenomenal contribution to potential accessibility at a quite a reasonable speed. Yeah. So admittedly, we didn't look at walking, and we didn't have data on our regular bus system in Cape Town, but just to make the argument here, you can see those four modes. So what I'm doing next is what Karel describes in his book, is to then use those axes to have a look at what is which areas are now below a sufficiency threshold. So now, for argument's sake, let's just calculate what the average car accessibility and average car mobility is, and then look at which areas, so those are indicated with those different points or circles, which areas fall below the average car accessibility and below average car mobility. And now, if for argument's sake, or from an equity point of view, we think that people are willing to accept a sufficiency threshold that is less than the average car accessibility, say 30% of that level, which is an arbitrary number that we can talk about. We start to see, especially if I zoom in, which areas, and those are the dots here, which each dot here indicates an area in the city of Cape Town, which areas are actually insufficient in terms of providing potential accessibility and potential mobility by train, by paratransit and BRT in the city. And actually, if we then map all these points, we will see that most of those areas are actually in areas where our vulnerable and low income population live. Yeah? So this kind of work, and I know I'm very quick here, but this kind of work we have now repeated in the city of Kigali and Blantyre to kind of see how does this compare in other cities, as well as, and that's work which is ongoing, is where we're trying to do this across a spatial temporal scale. So where we look at actual schedules or availability of modes throughout the day to see whether those discrepancies or inefficiencies happen throughout the day or at specific times of the day. And one of the preliminary findings that we can show you is that if you look at the minibus taxi, which is providing very high levels of accessibility and mobility in the peak period, it doesn't off peak. Yeah, so that's another interesting part of the analysis. So in the second example, and I will be much shorter now, in the second example, based on work I did with Dr. Ivan Nenyo, now in the University of Witwatersrand, we specifically look at the costs of public transportation from the areas that we just discussed about in example one. So, and knowing that institutions like the World Bank and IMF recommend that a public transport affordability benchmark is typically set at no more than 10% of someone's available or spendable income, we are interested to see literally how a travel budget restriction to 10, 15, or 20% of someone's spendable income impacts the potential accessibility to jobs in the city. Yeah? And what we do here is we are mapping the locations of low-income people in the city of Cape Town and their average spendable income. We map the locations of potential both formal and informal employment opportunities. And we have a transportation model, a GIS-based transportation model that allows us to model the actual public transport network, including its schedules, transfers, and fare structures. And what is very interesting and maybe also shocking to see is, especially in a city like Cape Town with its huge sprawl and apartheid spatial planning history, you see that if we would apply that benchmark even at 15% of someone's spendable income, you see a huge impact of income and affordability on potential job accessibility. So potential job accessibility reduces by as much as 80% when applying the affordability benchmark, recommended affordability benchmark of 10% of spendable income. It's 25% less at 15% of income, and so on and so forth. If we then look at who is most impacted by this, that's obviously the people who are living far away from the job opportunities because they have to travel far. And those happen to also be the people with the lowest income. So that clearly shows it's very expensive to be poor. My third and final example does kind of the same thing, but then in Ahmedabad in India. And what I really want to show you here is that we can use the exact same analysis as I did in the Cape Town example to now look at what is the impact of interventions. So what is the impact of interventions on changes in people's capabilities? So here again, for this particular city, we looked at the locations of the urban poor, and actually we used remote sensing data to figure out, because there was no data, to figure out who is living where and what level of poorness do the people have by using spatial or satellite images to recognize building structures and classify them as very poor, least to least poor. And we also looked at employment opportunities, both formal and informal jobs. And similar to our previous study, we built a GIS model to link urban poor dwellers, their potential job locations, and the potential transport modes that they use. In addition to this, we were responding to a proposed relocation scheme or a social housing scheme that they called it, where the city of Ahmedabad wanted to relocate 80,000 urban poor dwellers to social housing areas, which in itself was a very noble and good idea. But the locations of these 21 building projects, there were some concerns. And we used this model to now show that across the 21 locations, that actually at least five locations, where if you would bring the people there, they actually would not have any potential job accessibility left. So our study showed that, and I'm just showing you one particular piece of the analysis, that if you look at a travel time between 30 and 60 minutes, that's a relocation project, would reduce walking-based potential accessibility from about 350,000 jobs to less than 155,000 jobs. So only in 6 of those relocation locations there were winners, and in all the other 15 locations there will be losers of this particular scheme. So the next thing we did is, then knowing this, is to look at what can we do to serve those areas that are seeing their accessibility reduce. So we looked at the potential of an extended bus rapid transit service, as well as bicycle feeders to some of these relocation areas, to actually show that we would be able, with a relatively small investment, to improve potential job accessibility by 135% if we would introduce shared bike services in these 21 locations, in addition to extended bus rapid transit services. In conclusion, because I'm afraid I'm way over time, mobility and place-based resources people have access to, and the capabilities that they can achieve, determine the functionings available to them. And I hope to show you today that accessibility modeling and mapping allows us to map and analyze the impacts of various interventions on capabilities of specific groups of travelers, in my case, urban poor, and therefore serves as a measure of transport equity. And obviously, the usual disclaimer is that much more work is needed, and I'm looking forward to working with my colleagues here on improving this work. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Mark. Real great conceptualization and giving typical examples, a number of issues being raised on the platform, and we'll engage with that after. So we appreciate at this point, we just pull down the PowerPoints so that we can have the next presentation. That was really, I hope you will be perusing through the PowerPoint so that later on you can maybe respond to some of the concerns or the inputs or observations. Okay, let's now have our next presenter. Okay, Violet is on already, I think. Yeah, sure. You can go ahead. Okay, Violet, I can see it. It's on full PowerPoint now. Violet, we have your voice, or we are missing your voice? Violet?
Can you hear me now?
Oh, yes, good. We can, yeah.
Okay, yeah. So thanks so much for the opportunity to present. Let me show my face. So I'll take you through a presentation on intersectionality as a conceptual tool for exploring inequalities in mobility and access in Sub Saharan Africa. I see like the screen is not moving.
It's not moving. We did pre-test it. Maybe you pull it down and try it again, repost it again.
Yeah.
Just try that. Sometimes that happens.
You can see it now.
Yeah. Try to use the page down and see. Yeah, now it's moving.
Yeah, now. Yeah.
Good. Yeah.
So that is going to be my presentation. I have a very brief introduction. Then I'll go into the concept of intersectionality, and then look at how it is applied in mobility and access in Sub Saharan Africa in terms of issues, and then look at how we have applied it in our work, and then just looking at how also VREF has applied it in the last 5 years. So in terms of why intersectionality approach is important for Africa, we find that Africa has very unique and diverse contexts. We have very rich cultures, we have rich traditions, histories. We also have diverse ethnicities and languages, but also these rich cultures can be sources of entrenched social norms that may eventually lead to inequalities and exclusion. And also in terms of also the unique elements of aspects in Africa, we find that we have unique issues or social issues relating to conflicts that has resulted into, a large population of refugees and IDPs, but also like our youth population is among the highest in the world. And also we have very high poverty rates with most of our populations living below the poverty line, and other issues like even HIV and AIDS. So you can see that Africa has these, social aspects that may affect the social identities of people who live on the continent. And then in terms of these multiple social identities that come out of this, then we require to use an intersectionality lens in terms of understanding and addressing these developmental issues, especially those relating to mobility and access. So now let's delve into the concept of intersectionality. What does it mean? So when we look at the literature, we find that it has roots in Black feminism movement that recognize that gendered experiences were complex and multidimensional when viewed from different sectional lenses. So if you look at an issue from one dimension, you may be able to miss out on the complexities in terms of experiences that the individual may be going through because you have neglected the other lenses. And this term was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989, who is a feminist and legal scholar. And they observed that the law was experienced differently depending on one's race, on one's gender, class, and level of ability. So Crenshaw used the term intersectionality to refer to the double discrimination of racism and sexism faced by Black women during that time, and critiqued the single axis framework that was dominant in anti-discrimination law at the time. So from this history, we have seen that intersectionality now is being used in other disciplines as a tool that provides an explanation on how different axes of social identity and experience interact to produce different effects that cannot be explained if one is analyzing from a single category. So there's that diagram there that gives us the model that was coined by Crenshaw. And we are seeing that you can see intersectionality in terms of at the personal level, then you move on to the social and cultural level, and then also the organization, depending on the different spheres that a person belongs to or operates within, then all these aspects affect one's social identity. But it does not end there, because intersectionality in terms of the social categories must interact with the connected systems and structures of power that are found within communities, within the family, and the wider society. So if you stop at looking at social categories alone, then you are looking at diversity, but you must add on the connection it has with the systems and structures that go on to perpetuate vulnerabilities and marginalization in terms of access to resources, access to opportunity, intersectionality and mobility and access in, hello?
We lost you a bit for some few seconds. Now you are back. We just lost you very briefly. Just go on very briefly, okay. 20 seconds.
Yeah, so now we are on intersectionality and mobility and access in Sub-Saharan Africa in terms of the issues. So looking at our evidence, what are we seeing are some of the issues that warrant us to focus on these in terms of access and mobility. The first area is in terms of policy. And what are we seeing in terms of transportation policies? And we are seeing that it is not adequately capturing the multifaceted inequalities that are faced by marginalized groups. And also, it does not address structural causes of inequitable access to transport. And also, these policies are expert-driven and are non-participatory. So all these compounds to bring up the issue of less prioritization in planning and resource allocation. Also, when you look at research on access and barriers, in terms of transport and mobility, we are seeing that not every individual within the communities has the similar or opportunities to access transport and be able to move freely within their systems. And we are seeing differences in terms of income, in terms of urban residents and those in informal settlements in cities being affected more. We are seeing infrastructure and services that may not allow varied accessibility levels, especially for people with disabilities, children, girls, and women. Also, the literature is pointing at safety concerns and gender-based violence harassment for these marginalized and more disadvantaged groups within our societies in Africa. And lastly, in terms of issues, we are seeing that there is lack of data on intersectionality in terms of disaggregated data on experiences of people, and also in terms of their experiences in access and mobility. So the data that is there mainly looks at, people in their single, social identities, like most data is on gender alone or is on disability alone and so on. So that intersectionality is missing from the data that is available. So then what do we do next in terms of how we move forward? What tools can we use in terms of applying this framework in our research processes? And I'll draw so much from our own research for women in low income settings in urban areas. In two studies, one of them looked at access to motorcycle transport in an informal settlement in Nairobi, and another one in Dar es Salaam. And we are also currently looking at walking in terms of what is the value and also what is the the burden of walking for women living in informal settlements in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam. So I'm beginning by saying that if we want to look at this intersectionality, we must purpose in our research designs to actually deliberately choose topics, research topics, and our target populations to address the multiple marginalizations that we see within the communities we are studying. So for example, you might choose low income and how it intersects with people living in poor housing conditions. And then you can also investigate issues like age, education that intersect with these social identities. I'm also suggesting that for you to get the nuances in terms of these social identities and how they interact with the social systems and structures, you must engage with the stakeholders in the design of the study so that you are able to capture those aspects. Then you also have to use data collection tools that are participatory in terms of, getting disaggregated data on the individuals who are being left behind because of the inequalities experienced by intersectional discrimination. We are talking, so far in the literature, most people are using qualitative research to actually look at these aspects, but more and more, a few studies are also using quantitative approaches and using, these aspects of intersectionality as, variables that can be correlated to actually see the effects of the interconnections or intersections between them and the social systems. I've talked about the research process as a tool to give people with these intersectionality, social identities a voice in terms of, talking about their experiences, but also the process should be one that is, takes care of the marginalizations in terms of as you choose the venue, is it conducive for the people? Does it give them privacy to discuss their issues? In terms of interviews, separating the different groups depending on the cultural setting. So for example, in Kenya and Tanzania, in some of the communities we were researching, you have to separate men and women so that women have a chance to air their views given our entrenched social norms about power relations and so on. Also, we found it beneficial to separate the younger women and the older women so that during focus group discussions, they were drawing from each other's experiences and enriching the discussions. Of course, as usual, for these particular groups, then you must observe ethical considerations in terms of informed consent and voluntary participation. But also, we've come across some studies that, build the capacity of the participants by using them as peer researchers and so on. Also, in terms of data dissemination, this can be used as a tool, to voice intersectional needs and the plight of marginalized groups through policy briefs, journal papers, and so on. And I'm going to end by just sharing some studies that have applied this intersectionality perspective over the 5 years in VREF work. We have 8 projects that were applying this framework and looking at how gender intersects with the socioeconomic status, cultural identity, age. Some other studies were also looking at, coming up with a framework that can help in supporting, workability transitions. So I think that's the end of my discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Violet. I'm sure some of us who may not be very conversant with intersectionality as an approach are now apt to at least starting to reflect on how they can use that even in their various research work. Right now, I want to give a brief on each of the commentators so that when they start, reflecting on what has gone on in the 3 papers, I don't interfere. And I'll start with Gift, who will also be the first one to give his comments on the papers. Gift Dumeda is an associate professor in the geography department and a senior fellow of Transport Research and Education Center, Kumasi, at Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology, Ghana. His interests span transport and mobility research, transport relations with health and environment, urban dynamics, and geospatial information science and technology. That's good. Then we have Gail Jennings, a social scientist whose work focuses on gender, equity, and social impacts of transport and development interventions. Her recent work includes research and analysis to understand the social impacts of transport marginalization on women, seasonal workers, and elderly individuals in Malawi and Kenya, with the World Bicycle Relief project funded by VREF. Gail also worked with World Bicycle Relief further to understand the mobility needs of rural men and women through the lens of bicycle market system across Sub-Saharan Africa. She has worked with the World Bank to develop an online tool to assess and mitigate gender gaps in transport planning, and is currently engaged by GIZ TUMI, that may have been maybe over now, but maybe still going on, to develop an online training course in gender and mobility. In 2021, her work on assessing the impacts of COVID-19 mobility restrictions on women in Nigeria, Uganda, and Kenya, and Sudan were awarded Best Research Paper at the South African Transport Conference. Gail is South African and has worked extensively throughout West, East, and Southern Africa. So we'll have our last but not least, Enoch, who has worked with us along in this VREF efforts, Sam. He is an associate professor of transport geography at the University of Education, Winneba, Ghana. His research interests are diverse, spanning road safety, sustainable urban mobility, public transport safety, safety management and culture, traffic behavior of vulnerable road users, traffic enforcement and policing, vehicle safety regulations, and active transport and health. He has published extensively and has led many VREF and international research projects on these themes. Notably, he is the country lead and executive board member of a 4-year EU-funded AfroSafe project on road safety in low and middle-income African countries, which involves researchers from Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Netherlands, Ghana, Tanzania, and Zambia. Professor Sam is a past head of the Department of Geography, Education, and currently heads the Center for School and Community Science and Technology Studies at the University of Education, Winneba. So that's those are the team. That's the team of 3 that is going to reflect on these presentations. And let's have our first person. Gift, you are free to give your reflections. You can give a very briefly to 2 other of the frameworks that have been presented, but then dedicate your 6 or 7 minutes to the one of the ones assigned. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone. I'm sure everyone will agree that this has been such an insightful forum so far. We have had very, very great presentations so far, and very, very pumped to give my commentary. And I also want to thank VREF for such a forum. And of course, Winnie is such a calming presence in this forum, and it's very, very delightful to be part of this. So I will start my commentary first with Violet's presentation on intersectionality. So Violet, thank you very much for your insightful presentation. And you've explained that intersectionality plays a critical role in understanding transport dynamics, particularly in urban mobility and transport systems in general. You also emphasize our approach considers various identities, in this case, gender, race, disability, and to interact with individual experiences of transport-related access to opportunities. I took some key messages from your talk. One of them has to do with intersectionality can help reveal the complexities of transport experiences, and then underscore the importance of targeted solutions that consider diverse identities and circumstances. In other words, capabilities, as has been referred from Mark's presentation, of individuals in this case. I also like your linkage of intersectionality to transport policy and transport-related access to opportunities. 2 questions I have here just for consideration on your thoughts. It's one relating to identity and transport-related access. In terms of how do intersecting identities in terms of gender, disability, or class influence individuals' access to transport, and perhaps the approaches that we can use to measuring it. For instance, it is widely recognized that females and informal urban workers often take short and multiple journeys, which can attract very high travel fares. So for instance, how can intersectionality be applied to better formulate equitable travel fares for public transport, for instance? Also, females also face unique challenges in active transport, perhaps due to combined effects of gender and personal safety caused by harassment, which you have mentioned in your talk as well. So the question is, for instance, how can intersectionality be extended or applied to better enhance female use of active transport in our cities? Final question, just for your consideration, relates to interconnectedness of transport access and social equity, some of which you have addressed in your talk, but I'm interested in how intersectionality can be applied to intersect transport access with multiple social equity dimensions like housing, employment, health, or education. Right. I will now shift my attention to Anne's presentation on social justice principles for equity of transport, public transport in general. So Anne, you have really highlighted on the critical intersection of transport-related access, equity, and sustainable urban development. You've also indicated that by addressing systemic barriers that limit access to transport, policymakers can contribute significantly to reducing inequalities or inequities, promoting social development across our communities. I also took some key messages from your talk. One relating to identities and social identities are socially constructed, which really hit home for me in the sense that our social policies can do damage or can disadvantage some populations and communities. In other words, some of these marginalized communities that we are talking about are subject or are the result of social policies that we currently have in our cities and communities. I also took away from your talk that part of it, this is also part of global effort in fostering inclusive and sustainable urban environment in general. You've also touched on, of course, you've also touched on the idea of equality and equity, and I'm sure we are all on the same page that equity is not the same as equality in this case, and that it really specifically relates to systemic, social, economic, and environmental disadvantage that could impact individual access to opportunities in general. So my questions, two of them I have for you, relates to who benefits from public transport, and I just want to consider this in a little bit detail, because most of the time we think that it is only the direct users of public transport who are the beneficiaries, but there are also indirect users, and you refer to public transport being a public good, and I think expanding on this idea of who benefits from public transport could be very interesting in terms of not only the direct users of public transport in general could be the users or could be the beneficiaries in this case. And also the questions of, are there disparities in access to services based on race, gender, disability, of course, which relate to the intersectionality emphasized on earlier. And a final question for you relates to the minimum accessibility standard. And I'm sure it has been referred to from Carol as well as by yourself as well. And my question has to do with how can we differentiate this for different population groups? For instance, school-going children, for persons with disability. What is the minimum accessibility standard for persons with disability, for persons who live in informal urban communities, or for school-going children? How can we disaggregate it into different into those different dimensions of social equity? And now I will move on to Mark's presentation, which is the final one.
I think you have almost run off your time. You are supposed to handle two of them very briefly and one specific. So,
okay.
In another
right.
1 minute, just wind up. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. So, Mark, I took quite a number of messages from your talk as well, relating to how you have illustrated disparities of access to jobs for different population groups, which we have seen, and then also the domain of insufficiency. Now, this is quite an interesting idea in terms of domain of insufficiency. How can we characterize that for vulnerable population groups, for instance, informal urban residents, or for persons with disability? And the other question about measurements, our measurement of capabilities and functionings. I realized that you use potential mobility and accessibility levels to indicate the as a way of measuring the metrics for functionings and capabilities. My question has to do with how can we develop some other metrics that can combine the various dimensions of social equity in terms of housing, which you have referred to, but combining multiple of them in terms of, for instance, spatial disparities and barriers to utilization. For instance, the transport will be there, but it may not be you may not be able to use it because of cost or because of individual ability to use it. So that's my other question. And final one, if you permit me, Winnie, relating to sustainability of capabilities. In other words, how can we sustain capabilities that are developed for individuals over into the future? So we know that, so my specific question, just to conclude, is that how can transport systems be structured so that they do not only provide immediate access, but also sustain and enhance individual capabilities over time, so that if you have access to work, you can sustain that for future time. So thank you very much, Winnie.
Thank you very much. Very good points, and sorry for the harassment. It's just a matter of issue of time. So we'll have Gail now. I know Gail could be having connection problems, so probably we go first to, we have Enoch.
I think she's
Enoch?
back.
Oh,
She's back.
you are here, good. Okay, Gail.
Not only, sorry, and I have a cold as well,
Oh.
but yeah. Thanks, Winnie. Yeah, sorry, all of a sudden my internet just crashed at exactly the time that I most
It happens always.
So I was very grateful for that bit of extra time. So I don't have a particularly formal kind of response. I wanted to briefly just talk about what resonated with me of Anne's presentation and with Mark's, and then spend a bit more time with Violet. And I apologize always for looking in this direction, but my screen is here with my notes. So yeah, I mean, the thing that, and I don't know if this was on Anne's revised presentation or not, but something that resonated very much with me with Anne's presentation is that advancing social justice in public transport is a societal responsibility, not individuals' responsibility. And you know, I think that is something that we sometimes miss in the discussion, and that the fact that we need to be sort of definite and explicit in what we believe to be socially just transport. I think what is interesting for me just in my work is that, you know, I know, and you talked about introducing the concept of convenience. And I know also, you know, Carl was saying we don't want to get too sort of carried away with internal discussions, but looking at things like minimum standards and what are our definitions of convenient, it's interesting to me how difficult that is for people to reach a shared understanding of what is a minimum standard. And I think back to work that I've done interviewing women in Gauteng about what they wanted from public transport. And this was during the BRT discussion, particularly around things like quality, and a lot of discussion around people need better quality. And people were saying what they really would like are bus roofs that don't leak. And I've never forgotten that, because I thought, you know, we have this whole narrative about what we think is quality, and you know, people's expectations are just so low that to have a roof that doesn't leak in the bus is an example of what is a minimum standard. So, I mean, that was just, you know, commentary. I know when he asked if we would discuss your presentations based on work that we've done. So that's, I just wanted to talk about that, because the idea of minimum standards are really important when it comes to engaging with people about what people want, and planners can get carried away with what they believe people want and what is a minimum standard. So, yeah, and Mark, I mean, you know, we had a brief discussion before how I was sorry that you changed your title, because I thought proximity is not access is just kind of sums it all up. But well, some of the work that we did, also funded by VREF, looking at issues around accessibility in Malawi and Kenya in rural areas, we tried to understand the idea of accessibility, but not including job opportunities. So that speaks directly to what Heather was asking about earlier. So we were looking at a situation where women in particular were not trying to access jobs, but were trying to access markets, healthcare, boreholes, family, that kind of thing. And this was work looking at around bicycles, trying to understand what if the lever in that work was in fact to increase proximity in that sense. So even though proximity is not access, if you're working in an area where there is no public transport, so you don't have proximity to public transport, so therefore by giving women bicycles, you have dramatically increased proximity, and that now everybody has a very personal mode of transport that is in their house. What does that do for issues around accessibility? So that's looking at it from quite a different perspective. And yeah, I mean, that made a dramatic difference to people, because they could continue to access the same services they had always accessed, but now it was cheaper, it was quicker, it was more convenient, it was and that by using that proximity measure made a very big difference. They didn't have to wait. So that was just, I mean, that's just something that resonated with me about your work. But then I'm supposed to focus my time on Violet's work, so I'm sorry if I'm kind of giving equal time to everyone, and I must just have
your time is the issue. Yeah, you have some
right. Okay, so Violet. So yes, so this issue of intersectionality it's something again that with the same work I was talking about in Malawi and Kenya, we wanted to try and understand. Again, this was VREF funded work. We wanted to try and understand of the specific nature of sort of the different or multiple marginalizations that people experience in these same areas, and doing our formative research, talking to key informants, trying to understand who is most marginalized or who is most disadvantaged. This was a very sort of alien concept. It was, well, the people who are poor are disadvantaged and everyone is poor. And so we really had to try and understand, but do women experience their poverty differently? Do men experience poverty differently? No. I mean, the key informants were, it was, you know, so this concept is not well known and not well used. But after interviewing people in this work and trying to trying to just through our focus groups, trying to understand, are there different kinds of experiences of transport disadvantage or transport poverty based on our own understandings of this intersectionality. We felt that in some respects, the nuances didn't matter so much in this particular work, that when you are looking at, or in circumstances where there is just such dramatic lack of access and poverty, that to some extent delving into the nuances of intersectionality might not have led to any different outcome. So that was, that was something that I was thinking about when listening to Violet's work. And just one last thing before Winnie tells me to shut up is that also, when it comes to, often now when we talk about, when we're looking at gender or women in transport, we tend to have this narrative now, which is that when women's needs are met, all needs are met, because it's as if we need to justify why we are focusing on women's needs in transport. So we have this line that when women's needs are met, then we are meeting men's needs. So, men, don't worry, we're not ignoring you when we, and that is really quite, that's really going back, it reinforces this whole single axis framework of social identity, that whole narrative. So that's something I just wanted to leave us with to think about, is that, I think we need to get away from that kind of justifying of why we look at people who are marginalized. So that's my very rapid and sort of flu drug fueled presentation.
Thank you so much, Gail. It's always good to throw balls on these, conventional concepts of, consensus. So it's very good, the last words you're leaving us to think whether we can really assume that if you sort the issues of women, then you sort everything else. Yeah. So let's just have Enoch on board. Sam, it's your turn. Your 6-8 minutes are still there.
Yeah. All right. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and to Mark, Violet, and what's the name, and for wonderful presentations. Yeah. Gift has already given you some pages of questions, so I wouldn't go that line. So you can reflect on that later. So I'll just give a brief comment. So first with Mark, yes. And first I must also mention that these are very good concepts or approaches, and these are particularly those that, are not those that I've used in my work, but as I listen to you and as I read your PowerPoint, I see some linkages with works that I've done over the period, especially the past 2-3 years involving persons with disability, which also cut across the issues that we've looked at. So particularly impressive or interesting was and I'm speaking to Mark here, the issue of proximity not being accessed. That is key, and you very well elaborated on that, especially the fact that being proximate doesn't mean it's safe or disability friendly. So these are things we need to really look at and then inform what we do going forward, especially for those we are very much focusing on, the urban poor who live very far off from opportunities. So using the capability approach really will help drum home their needs and then get to know in depth what they are doing. And that also lands me on Violet's presentation on intersectionality, which is also very key to what I've done over the years with persons with disability. For instance, you realize that, and from studies we've done in Ghana and Kenya, we realize that these are people who are not involved in what is being done about them. So there's this quote, nothing about us without us. So, which is very important. If you are doing something about somebody, the person should be involved. But you realize that they are virtually absent in all of these important policy decisions, which really go to hurt them in the long run. At the end, it doesn't help in what they do. And particularly impressive is the issue of, you did highlight data paucity and then the lack of disaggregated intersectional data, which I believe are things worth looking at moving forward. And so I had a question in there, but I think one of the questions from Gifts also touched based on that. So once you answer, I think I will also be good. And now to Anne's work, which focused on social justice as an approach, which is very good concept. And as I reflect on this, I look at my own work and I see some linkage with the universal design principle, right? And then also the issue of the social dimension of disability, talking about the fact that it's society disables us, but not, we shouldn't be looking at the physical disability, but what society is doing to disable us. For instance, the way we plan cities make it very difficult for all of us to function, especially for persons with disability. So we should be able to look at that as we move forward. And that also ties in with the United Nations Convention on Persons with Disability, urging government to provide a level playing field for everybody to be able to access opportunities independently. That is the key word, independently. So the issue of social justice really comes into play. And I like the issue of your reference of engineer, is it Dairo? Talking about the fact that social justice should reflect civilization. Yes, a civil society should provide a level playing field for everybody, not make it difficult for some and then good for the other. And the fact that social justice is also a matter of society responsibility. And then moving from diagnosis to intervention, as Carol mentioned earlier on. So in our previous work in Ghana and Kenya involving persons with disability, we tried not to just diagnose the issues, but provide some interventions to see and study these interventions to see how useful they will be. And then we can now go to government and say, okay, these are very useful things, so you should look at for sustainability's sake. And so in some, these are very good concepts that has also opened my eye to certain things that I missed in previous works that I've done and which I should be looking forward to in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much, Enoch Sam. I think I will not go back to the presenters. You just wait. If I have time, you will get back a bit, the presenters. But I think there has been a lot of engagement on platform. There are some responses from the presenters. I know like Mark had responded to this issue of gender that had been raised by Alan and the rest. But I also have seen there was a response a bit from Harry on issue of development finance institutions and then issue of experts. So if Harry, you are still on board, I'll give you 1 minute or two. And then Constant Cap, because you work with UN Habitat and you are trying to make some suggestions on how else we can do it in terms of, do we educate engineers or what do we do? And you are a planner. So let me just have, if Harry is still on board, Harry, the floor is yours, then we'll be followed by Cap. If they're not, then I'll move on. Harry, are you still on?
Yes, Winnie, I'm
yeah,
here.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I actually made the comment in response to something that Constant posted in the first instance about trying to influence how international development finance institutions work in these projects we've been discussing today in this forum. And through my work for quite a few of these development institutions, what always just blows my mind is that they have minimum budget targets of hundreds of thousands of euros or dollars or whatever currency you're thinking about. And we should tie into that and propose projects that can use up these budgets. And the context of these conversations that I've had have been in relation to why nobody's investing in walking and cycling infrastructure. Well, it's just too cheap. And so the challenge that we face, and I also responded to Heather's last comment about the community that people have been talking in the chat about, a community of social justice. Is it possible for us to actually phrase expensive projects that would lead to investment in these unseen, unacknowledged forms of transport and community networks. So work with the constraints that we have, and this is a big one, phrasing expensive projects, which we're not doing, but we have the skills, the knowledge, the experience in a community such as this to do just that.
Great, thank you very much. Constant, are you still on board? Cap? Constant? Okay, if Constant is not there, is Heather or Randall still on board? Oh, go ahead. No, have they left? Okay.
Yeah, sorry, Constant and Randall have left. Sorry.
They've left. Okay, so let me just go to the plenary. Is there anybody who would want to observe before I go for 1 minute running with the presenters? Anybody who wants to make an observation from the audience at this point? Comment or observation or question? We are good to go. So let's just shift back to a 1 minute, let's say 2 minutes each for the presenters. I hope you are listening very carefully to the commentators. They've raised a number of issues. I'll not go back into reading them. You can pick the ones you want to respond to. So let me just start. Let's start with Anne. Anne, do you have any response to make at this point on what you've heard? Anne?
Sure. Thanks, Winnie, and thanks to everyone for all the comments and observations that you've made. Very, very insightful. Let me first begin by appreciating Mark's statement that proximity is not access. And for me, this really raises serious social justice issues of proximity. And the question of who benefits and who does not benefit, we need to ask, benefit from what perspective? And who really benefits? And can we talk about socially just public transport for each category of individuals, maybe also using an intersectionality lens, perhaps? I would say yes, in the sense that if you look at mobility of a person with disability, what do they need if, for example, they're to access a vehicle, a public transport vehicle? They need sufficient space first, they'll occupy more space. If they're on a wheelchair, they will need a space to put their wheelchair at no extra cost. So the issue of affordability comes in. And if you're talking about a child, perhaps the issue of a child is they do not make their own decisions in terms of how they move. So it becomes here more of maybe not individual, but back to a societal issue in terms of how they move. But what can they influence? Are they prepared enough to know that this is a minimum that we can take, even as we have moved? The issue of safety comes in as a priority. What about if I'm moving somebody who is sick? What will I need as a person who is moving this individual who perhaps is sick? So for me, at the minimum, I would say that we must have minimum standards as a society, that I said we must repeat them, we must emphasize them, and we must, if I may quote the statement that people kept saying, we must make noise about, that we need the minimum standards of a socially just public transport so that people can move to where they want to move, be safe, secure, and more importantly, we need to have provide equal quality of services for all, including the voiceless. And again, in terms of food benefits, there's another work that was done, the labor impact assessment that was done by the ITF. For those of you that might be keen, you may want to look at it. So let me stop there for now. Thank you, Winnie.
Thank you very much, Anne. That's great. I can see Mark is being very proactive. Mark, do you want to add any more on what you've done on the chat, which is great? Any response you want to verbalize?
Yeah, well, I think I picked up 2 important questions / comments from the moderators, and the one is about this intersection with the gender, perhaps disabilities and other things. So no, we have not done that, but yes, I think some of the work that includes looking at schedules for paratransit and formal public transport, as well as specifically looking at discretionary activities, will probably benefit or link more to gender than anything else. So currently it's peak hour jobs, which it has a clear male dominant dimension. So I think we can twist it in that direction. The other point, and I think Gift was making it, and I need Karel here, relates to the normative part of this sufficiency threshold. And Karel has actually written quite a few papers in the last few years that speak about what is sufficient and what not. And I have to admit, we have just set it based on what Karel Martin's book also discussed. Just set that level and see what happens. And I actually want to go back to transportation modeling, this famous 4-step model that is often criticized. There we use a level of service, remember, for those who have done that. So from A to F, and we say level D, E, F, that's a congested road. And that's what should focus, that's where we should focus our attention on. What I'm doing with Karel's theory is actually, instead of indicating which road to look at, is which people, which area are in that domain of insufficiency, and those should be pointers for further action. So so that's what we're currently doing, looking at, okay, those areas that came out as low. I didn't have time to present it, but it also includes the richest area of Cape Town, where people deliberately want to be low. Yeah. So further disaggregation is necessary. Yeah, to see, okay, who are we actually talking about, and who are really in that domain, and how can we then further disaggregate that to gender and other things. Yeah. Maybe Karel, maybe you can say a few words, if the chair allows, about the sufficient.
Yeah, sure. He will. Can you, Karel? Go ahead. You want to say a few words?
I can talk very long about it.
Yes.
I think it's something we should just start embark upon. We are too modest and that's what I try to say with my presentation. We are too modest on the one hand, but also too self-critical. And it's not a way to move the field forward. You say, there is an absurd standard in the traditional approach that says from D downwards is bad. Although we see the world around us functioning continuously with D roads, right? Level of service D on most roads in metropolitan areas is D, and the cities keep functioning well. And typically, where there's D, actually there's a flourishing economy. So they have a random criterion to set up the problem. I think we shouldn't be afraid to set it also, for now, set it somewhere, and that will help us move forward. While in parallel, do research. So they're trying to figure out whether the standard is meaningful. And this takes lots of work. And we cannot wait with setting standards till we know it, because we will never know it. That the standard will always be in the end normative.
Thanks a lot.
Political
Thanks a
decision.
lot for that observation. Let's have Violet, last but not least. Violet, there were a number of questions, but just pick some that you think you want to use your 2 minutes to respond to.
Yeah, maybe I'll just start with Gail's comment on when it comes to people living in poverty, women living in poverty, that when you want to get nuances on their experiences, you find that they're not really coming out. And I'm suggesting that maybe going deeper into their, other social identities can bring out these nuances. Giving the example of some work we are doing on walking among low-income women. And we were finding that when you put them in separate groups and they are discussing as younger women, older women, those nuances seem to come out. Like what came out was that older women are seeing that walking helps them in terms of health and well-being, while younger women who don't have those issues at their age in terms of hypertension and so on are seeing like walking has no value in terms of health and well-being. On the other question on multiple identities and the challenges that people face in transport, I'm going to respond and say that this group of people, actually their challenges are compounded when they have these multiple social identities. And give an example of a study that we did on motorcycle transport, where women, because of their low income, are not able to access motorcycle transport, and yet it's the most flexible given their gender roles that are multiple and their journeys that are, you know, short but intersecting throughout the day. Their low incomes are not able to, you know, make them access this means of transport that is flexible and suitable for them. So looking at these multiple identities in terms of transport is very beneficial if we want to get the nuances. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and for sticking to time. I think the entire plenary presenters and everybody who has contributed will agree with me that this has been very rich. But one thing I think in coming from development studies is that things keep changing. So when we are raising issues of whether we have all the attributes to predict or to plant or to design, every time I think we'll never have a perfect fit. I think I had Martin very well when he said we should keep refining. And really, this is the way to go, to keep refining, to keep researching, to keep also testing them on the ground. In other words, linking up with practice and trying to see how some of these models and approaches work on the ground and their shortcomings, which can always be built on going forward. So I'm very grateful on my end, and I guess everybody else, including VREF. And I really want to now thank everybody and to also call Jane to spend the next 3 minutes or so to just tell us what's next, because she's always telling us what's next or whether she's happy after we have finalized all this hard work behind the scenes, which she does. Jane, go ahead.
Thanks, Winnie. You mean I get more than 1 minute? That's wonderful.
Yes,
first, I want to join Winnie on behalf of VRF and thanking everyone sincerely for a really stimulating, engaging session today. It's been so exciting and stimulating, I think, for all of us. Everyone has come in on some level and appreciated the talk. So thank you very much to our speakers, commentators, Winnie, also Mary Mwagi, who is our rapporteur. Thank you all. Just 2 comments. This mini series of extended research forums are about the results from 5 years of new mobility and access studies. They're about celebrating the good research and the good researchers in our program, and I think that's really illustrated by today. We've seen some very interesting studies here. So I would like to tell you about the next 2 coming up. These sessions are always on a Wednesday, as you know. The next extended 3-hour, more plenary type of gathering like this one will be 5 weeks from today, October 23rd. The title is Practices and Challenges in Informal and Shared Mobility / Paratransit, with particular emphasis on lessons for capacity building and training. You're going to be hearing some really dynamic speakers, some of whom are here today, but also many speakers from VREF's program for informal shared mobility. So this will be an exciting meeting between researchers from the MAC program and the ISM program, as we call it. Please book it in. Save the date, will be coming soon. Finally, the 3rd and final special session in this mini-series will be held a month later, November 22nd. And the theme of that is governance for sustainable inclusive mobility. And again, we have a lineup of really exciting speakers for that. So we hope you will be there. Again, I join everyone, Winnie and all, and thanking you. And I think we do what we usually do, Winnie. Everyone turns on their cameras, so we get the feeling that we're around the table. And then we come in and wave to each other, and it's
Indeed
really exciting today. So thank you very much. Over to you, Winnie.
Thank you very much. And this is really the time to also appreciate Karen, who has been really pinning us up and ensured we joined the team. Thank you very much, Karen. And we are all good to go. Let's have all ourselves saying bye to each other. If you have your camera on as we wind up. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Winnie. It was really good.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Winnie. And the next sessions will be at the same time slot in answer to Mark's question. Please remember that as well.
And remind me of the 2 dates, Jane?
Yes,
21
the
November.
23rd of October
23rd
and 27th of November.
Okay, thank you.
We'll be receiving save the date soon. Which
October won't work for me, but the other one I will be. Cheers. Bye.
Thanks very much, and thank you.
Bye-bye.